us now is Seyward Darby. She's the story editor at Foreign Policy Magazine. Seyward, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So you wrote a really, really fascinating and important piece, another lens to look at the Rwandan genocide 20 years later. And it's called The Tragic, Mostly Forgotten Story of the Other Ethnic Group Slaughtered in Rwanda. What I'd like you to do is remind us of the basics of that horrible, horrible event, and then explain to us what was this other ethnic group in Rwanda that was also victimized by the genocide that we haven't really heard about before.
Sure. So Monday of this week marked the 20th anniversary since the genocide happened, and it was one of the worst events of the 20th century, arguably of human history. Some 800,000 people were killed in the course of about 100 days. And the general outline of the story is that extremist Hutus, which is one of the ethnic groups in Rwanda, slaughtered ethnic Tutsis, another ethnic group. And at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the Hutus accounted for about 85% of the population, and the Tutsi accounted for about 14% of the population. And it was an absolutely horrific event. And a lot of the narrative since then has discussed how the international community failed to intervene effectively, and the ways that it could have been halted sooner or prevented. And my story looked at the third ethnic group in Rwanda, which accounts for, at the time and still now, about 1% or less of the population. And that group is called the Twa. And the Twa have long been the most marginalized ethnic group in the country. This dates back hundreds of years. And this comes from a variety of different factors, but one of them is that historically the Hutu were agriculturalists. They grew crops. Tutsis were pastoralists, and the Twa were hunter-gatherers. And they were looked down upon, according to one anthropologist, as more or less than human because of the way they lived their lives. And over time, they worked in patronage systems with other ethnic groups, and gradually were forced out of the forests where they had been hunter-gatherers. And during the colonial period, they worked for the Tutsi court, which many Hutus saw as a threat to their existence, the Tutsi court, that is. And anthropologists have described how that built up even more discrimination against the Twa. And in the genocide, the Twa were victims as well. It's very hard to get exact numbers, but it's believed that about 30% of their overall population, which would have been about 10,000 people, died or were killed, and a comparable number fled the country. And it's a story you just don't hear very much about, in part because it's difficult to get information on them, in part because their number is so small, but it also has to do with the fact that the Tutsi government that has been in power ever since has, really solidified a narrative of, Hutus versus Tutsis, and then since then tried to erase a lot of the ethnic designations that have existed in the country for a long time.
Yeah, so that's really important. We're definitely going to come more to that later in the conversation. I want to take it back just briefly, though. So if there's the colonial context for this genocide was maybe in some respects that the Belgians who were the kind of colonial occupiers of Rwanda, there's a perception, and probably an accurate perception, that they favored Tutsis during the colonial era. I guess what I'm trying to get at is to what extent were these ethnic divisions defined by the colonial experience? Were they kind of generated by that, or were they pre-existing and exploited by the colonial administration? And then how does that play into the politics of the genocide?
Sure, there were definitely pre-existing distinctions between people. And again, this was based on a lot of different things. In part, it was based on groups' relationships to the land, as I described. It was based on a number of other things as well. But I do think that during the colonial period, there was sort of an emphasis placed on these things. And as you said, and again, this is sort of boiling it down to bare bones, but the Tutsi were favored to a certain extent, and the Hutu over time, resented that and came to power after the colonial period. And so it would be wrong to say that ethnic distinctions did not exist prior to the colonial period, which is something that the government at times, the current government in Rwanda, has tried to say was the case.
Right.
But it is also true that the colonial period, cemented and exploited them to a large extent.
Okay, so we have the story now, and we're of this other group that was implicated very seriously by the genocide. You think you said upwards of maybe 10,000 people were killed. Was there, during the genocide, was it simply that the Hutus were, was it all lumped together along with this pre-existing racism towards the Twa? Was it like, look, you're going to be part of it, maybe you're not the first priority, or was there some attempt to not just attack the Twa, but actually exploit them or maybe make them complicit themselves in the genocide against the Tutsis?
Definitely. I mean, as with any situation like this, as with any conflict, the dynamics are not black and white and clear cut. And, it's frequently mentioned, and I say this at the beginning of my piece, when you hear the general outline of the genocide, it's that Hutus slaughtered Tutsis and some moderate Hutus, moderate referring to their political stance. And that's because at the time of the genocide, Rwanda was in the midst of a civil war between the Hutu government and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a Tutsi-led exile group predominantly based in Uganda. And prior to the genocide, there's been lots of documentation of this, of radio stations and other places, firing people up with a call to Hutu power in Rwanda. And in the course of that process, there were accusations thrown at the Twa, that the Twa were aligned with this Rwandan Patriotic Front. Right. And even before the genocide began in April of 1994, Twa villages were destroyed in Rwanda by some Hutu fighters. When the genocide began, there's been documentation of Twa being targeted for who they were ethnically. There were identity cards at the time, and if you were identified to be Tutsi or Twa, you could be killed, and often were killed by Hutu fighters. That being said, there's also been some documentation of Twa themselves being implicated as killers. And there is an organization called the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization that has reported on what they call exceptional cases where the Twa participated in murdering Tutsis. And in some cases, the Twa who were involved say that they were forced to by Hutu militia, that they were told, if you don't do this, we will kill you and we will kill your families. In other cases, they may have participated willingly, although, again, because it's difficult to get exact numbers on what happened, it's unclear why they would have done that willingly. And Philip Gurevich, who wrote a very famous book about Rwanda called We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, has said that in some cases Twa may have been used by Hutu fighters to rape Tutsi women, and the idea there would have been that because the Twa were considered, a lower class and less than human group, that it added, insult upon injury to what was being done. But I think that it's important to note that based on the research that has been done by anthropologists and activists, most of the Twa were likely victimized as opposed to being involved in the perpetration. Again, the UNPO, the organization, has said that these were exceptional cases.
Absolutely. So this is, obviously in the broader kind of global discourse, as you said in the beginning of the interview, the victimization of the Twa is definitely not central to the conversation for a variety of the reasons you outlined. In Rwanda, in the under the present government of Paul Kagame, who we should say has been really lauded by the international community, by Western leaders like Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Tony Blair, as a kind of exemplary African leader who's brought Rwanda back not just culturally and politically from the genocide, but also economically. There's a whole other discourse about Kagame, that there's a lot of human rights violations and a lot of problems under his government, which perhaps you could get into. But starting specifically with the Twa in the post-genocide era and in this kind of brave new era of the Kagame leadership, how are they outside of the narrative as well, or is the reality different inside Rwanda than it is in global discourse?
Absolutely. Well, one of the big legacies of the Kagame government is that they have really emphasized national unity. They've said, there's a quote actually from a 2001 report by their National Unity and Reconciliation Commission that says, well before the colonial era, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa were all Rwandans on equal footing. And as I mentioned, that isn't true. Anthropologists have shown that in fact there were divisions and there was discrimination and violence on the basis of ethnicity. And yet since the genocide, one of the big things the Kagame government has done is tried to say we are all Rwandans. We are not divided by ethnic group. And in its 2003 constitution, it more or less decided to erase ethnic designations, and it has worked hard to suppress what it calls divisionist activity. And divisionist activity is very broadly defined and has been used, human rights advocates say, to actually suppress political dissent, people who disagree with the regime that's been in power since 1994. The way that this has affected the Twas is a little different. Basically, they're not allowed to say we are Twa, and the government has more or less cracked down at times. In 2004, the Ministry of Justice said it was going to stop funding NGOs that specifically targeted the Twa if they insisted on being designated as such as a group. So they've accused the Twa of being divisionist and pushing back against this idea of we're all Rwandans and we're not divided by ethnicity. But what that means for the Twa on a public policy level is that there is a failure to find solutions for their very specific problems. And as a long marginalized group, those problems include high rates of illiteracy, very high rates of unemployment. And in Rwanda, one thing that's very important is land. Rwanda is a very small country, and people have written about how, fights over land and disagreements over land actually was a part of the lead up to the genocide as well. And the government has been managing the land very tightly, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And the Twa have been found to be particularly disadvantaged in this respect, to have very small parcels of land, not enough to feed their families. But it's very difficult to say we as an ethnic group are challenged because the government doesn't want to actively recognize them as a group. And one of the, I say more famous cases, but it's really not so famous because you don't hear about the Twa very often. But there was a small Twa advocacy organization that was instructed by the government to change its name, to not use the word indigenous, to say, we are a group that has been here a long time. And the government said if they didn't do that, they would be denied legal status. And they finally relented in 2007, and today call themselves the community of Rwandan potters, as opposed to the community of indigenous Twa. And the reason they call themselves that is because over time, as the Twa have been increasingly pushed out of the forests where they have lived for a long time, they've turned to pottery, to making pottery to find income. And the organization's leader said, I think as recently as a few months ago, that he sees the Twa as invisible to the government at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not drawing a direct analogy here, but it just seems like that is such a, we're all Americans, so we cannot talk about the specific problems of African Americans or women.
Exactly.
There is just that kind of that papering over, which never allows for, you can't turn the page of history until it's been written. So so basically, and I'm guessing that this has very specific, I mean, you've already said the specific effects in terms of crackdowns on human rights and civil society organizing, but we're also talking about a history that you alluded to even before the genocide, where in addition to, I mean, taking the Twa specifically, so obviously there's a colonial history in Rwanda which implicates taking land from all Rwandan ethnic groups
Hmm.
because that's what colonialism is. And then
Hmm.
with the Twa specifically, you're talking about a colonial experience. Then you're also talking as hunter-gatherers. You're getting land taken from maybe people who farm, by people who farm, other ethnic groups or pastoralists.
Correct.
So they've taken it from all of these sides, plus their own refugee, their own fleeing during the genocide, as well as victimization. So is this also, I guess, is this also very specifically affecting how they're getting reparations or compensation essentially to help them kind of rebuild their lives in the modern Rwandan economy?
Absolutely. There's been some research showing that more or less nothing has been done to help them specifically. And I mentioned in my article that there have been some token moves over time. In 2006, Kagame appointed a Twa senator, for instance. But ultimately, there's just been very little targeted concern for their well-being. And with regard to reparations specifically, in 1998, the government set up something that's known as the FARG. It's a survivors fund, and it's intended to help financially those who were targeted in the genocide and survived. And research has shown by two anthropologists in the United States, I believe, that this money has been channeled overwhelmingly to Tutsi. Now, on the one hand, the Tutsi were the ones who were, proportionally speaking, the most victimized.
Right.
On the other hand, research shows that some of this money has actually gone to Tutsi returnees to the country who left well before the genocide. You'll remember that I mentioned the Rwandan Patriotic Front had been in Uganda prior to the genocide, and there were lots of Tutsi refugees living outside of Rwanda's borders before the killings of 1994. And what has been shown is that some money has been going back to people who were not in the country during the genocide. And similarly, there hasn't been a strong concern showed for the Twa's experience and what sort of compensation and reparations they should receive after the fact, or should have received after the fact.
Right. So, I guess moving more broadly as we move towards the end of this conversation, I mean, I think that this is another strand that implicates the Kagame government, and it seems like part of some of the outpouring of support for him from the international community has been because, look, he's had some real successes, and he has, he's an effective manager in some respects. But it also seems like a kind of, in some cases, even just guilt from maybe someone like President Clinton because of really in fact, the very shameful conduct of Western governments and the American government during the genocide has led to this kind of, because it's not just issues with the Twa, there's all sorts of other human rights issues that this government has been implicated in. And I think, how long can an arrangement be sustained where the Kagame government is not held to account because it arose from this horrific history, and because it's, I guess in the overall sense, managed this transition fairly well? How long can that be used to kind of sweep these other things under the rug? And I guess connected with that, is he with all of these blemishes, is he still, the best shot that Rwanda has right now?
Sure. Those are hard questions. And to the first one, how long can this go on? A really long time.
Right.
It has been going on for
Right.
a really long time. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, the RPF government that took over went after Hutu refugees. And in 1996, they went into what was then Zaire and is now Democratic Republic of Congo, and went after Hutus. And we have a wonderful piece by Michaela Wrong, who's a fabulous journalist who covers East Africa, and she wrote a piece just prior to my piece coming out about accusations against the Kagame government from that time on. And, she touches on the fact that they went after these Hutu refugees, but she also talks about some very disturbing allegations that the government has been murdering political dissidents, and not just murdering them within Rwanda's borders, but outside. There was a pretty high-profile case at the end of 2013 in South Africa where a known political dissident was murdered in a hotel room, and the Kagame government has denied these accusations. But increasingly, there is concern that they are true. South Africa actually expelled some Rwandan diplomats. The U.S. State Department has expressed concern. And yet, just like many, governments that abuse human rights, whether we're talking about assassinations or suppressing dissent, suppressing media, whatever it may be, aid continues to flow when development is going well. And Michaela Wrong talks about this in her piece and cites Ethiopia as another example of, where aid has continued to flow from the West, even when human rights concerns are very, very large. And so, is aid always going to continue exactly as it has? Is support always going to continue exactly as it has? No, and I do think we are seeing some shifts. At least one senator in the U.S. Congress has talked about needing to limit aid to Rwanda on the basis of accusations about assassinations and other abuses. And yet, there is a lot of thinking and concern that if you are to cut off flows of money, cut off that support, other things could go wrong. And it's true that since coming to power, the Kagame government has overseen a very peaceful Rwanda. And if you consider that in comparison to places like Liberia, Angola, other countries that had various spurts of really horrific violence and continued to fall back into them, stretching 20 years pretty peacefully inside of Rwanda's borders is quite remarkable. And so, there are no easy answers here, but I do think that already over the course of 2 decades, we've seen the West continue to show support for the Rwandan government and for Paul Kagame, even as these allegations have mounted, even as they have become more intense. And again, that started right after the genocide. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. I think it will be very interesting to see what happens in the coming years. And I definitely recommend reading Michaela Wrong's piece to get a better sense of what some of these accusations against the government have been.
Well, and it's actually fascinating because in some respects, it's also another subtext of our own kind of transition to targeted killing programs and things like that, how that also complicates even having a conversation about that in some respects. But this is an excellent piece. The piece is the tragic, mostly forgotten story of the other ethnic groups slaughtered in Rwanda. Seyward Darby, story editor at Foreign Policy Magazine. Thank you so much for joining me on the Majority Report.